wonderful lunch, everybody. My name is Tomi Järventie. I think I've met most of you guys at some point in life. With me is Stephen Cooper, my beloved team member. He's the tech lead, together with Rob, who is going to be on the stage a bit later. The idea here is to go through some of the kind of best practices, and actually we'll continue from what Stephen was talking about earlier about best practices for 6 gig, Wi-Fi 7 type of things. A few slides about that, and then we'll jump into the Mist dashboard to show some of the, maybe some things that are more basic, but still I every now and then come to a situation where things are not actually done by kind of the best practice way. So we'll go through some of the basics, again related to RF templates, organizational settings, site settings, SSID configuration, stuff like that. And the idea here, hopefully, is that we'll have an interactive thing for the afternoon. So feel free to ask anything, I guess. Petri is starting to run out of these extremely sweaty hats, but whoever is missing still can try to get one. So I'll hand it to Steve. Stephen first. Go ahead.
Thank you, Tomi. And I think also would mention you've brought your lab setup here too. So what we'll do is we'll run through some of the examples in the dashboard, but we'll actually set up a 5 and 6 gigahertz SSID with WPA3 that you can all connect to and just run a speed test, do whatever you want to, but at least then that way, whether it's a 5 gigahertz device, you can confirm that WPA3 is working. If you've got a 6 gigahertz capable device, fantastic, you'll have it working there as well. And if we get enough people connecting, we might better show some stuff in the Mist dashboard. But yeah.
Just one caveat about the setup. So most of you cannot see it, but we have a Cradlepoint 4G, 5G gateway here. So we are connecting directly to internet with 5G SIM, which has I think max 300-400 megs per second downstream and something lousy like 50 down upstream. So that will be the bottlenecking thing here if you are running speed tests like everybody will be doing.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. Some of the slides I skipped through before was just sort of more relevant to show it in the dashboard as well. So when you're actually starting to deploy 6 gigahertz, well ahead of time, you want to go on the journey of the transition to enabling WPA3. Because WPA3 is mandatory in 6 gigahertz, that's probably going to be your largest hurdle or biggest friction point of deploying AP45s or in future AP47s with Wi-Fi 7 is getting to that level of support and compatibility with your clients for WPA3. The next part is obviously the RF design component, which we'll let the Harmona team go into a bit more details around designing for 6 gigahertz, but we'll talk about the RF templates and the RF configuration. I briefly mentioned about channel bandwidth being relevant too, so we'll show that in the RF templates too, and cover things around preferred scanning channels. So I think the next one was more about, okay, what do you do? Depending on what your SSIDs are today, depending if you've got ADA 2NX versus pre-shared key or multi-pre-shared key, maybe an open guest network, depends on where you are at your journey today in terms of still doing dual bandwidth 2.4 and 5, or maybe you're primarily doing 5 gigahertz everywhere. That will also influence, which way you're going to head with this. But essentially, what we'll set up is a dual band 5 and 6 gigahertz SSID. One, because that's, as I mentioned, that's a good level of support these days. It's very rare, unless you're operating in an environment where people are using a lot of older or cheaper smartphones, like some older Androids, which are only 802.11n 2.4 only. Most devices these days are 802.11 AC or at least 5 gigahertz capable. So your mileage may vary, but 5 gigahertz plus 6 gigahertz, 5 gigahertz being enabled for that SSID also then takes advantage of the reduced neighbor reports that I mentioned earlier. So that means if your clients are probing and scanning on 5 gigahertz first, they would then receive in those probe responses and also ideally see in the beacons that there is a 6 gigahertz SSID available. So while they might be scanning on 5 gigahertz, if they're 6 gigahertz capable, they could take advantage of the reduced neighbor report and just associate straight to 6 gigahertz without going to 5, then an interband roam to 6. So that's why we're going to do 5 and 6. And that's why we've got this third bullet point. If you do a 6 gigahertz only SSID, that's fine, but make sure you do have another 5 gigahertz SSID on those APs, because reduced neighbor reports can work across different SSIDs. It doesn't have to be the same SSID. It's ideal if it is, but from the interband roaming perspective, if I mentioned, but it's just something to consider. If you have no 5 gigahertz SSIDs on your network and you're just deploying 6 gigahertz only, bleeding edge, you just want to cut off all backwards compatibility, it's actually going to take clients a long time to scan for 6 gigahertz networks and then associate to them. So it actually is counterintuitive. Guest and OWE, as I mentioned before, OWE support out there is still improving. I think if it was 12 months ago we were running this event, I would have said if you have Apple devices, don't run OWE, because they just do not have a good time with associating smoothly each and every time to OWE, and they weren't roaming well. Now they've, macOS and iOS has a lot of improvements for OWE. And generally what we're seeing customers do and managed service providers do is still keep your legacy stuff on 2.4 and 5. Regardless of whether it's a WPA3 or WPA2 consideration, usually they're just keeping those sorts of devices on 2.4 and 5. Move all of your corporate managed devices or laptops, modern laptops, modern smartphones or BYD devices on 5 and 6 gigahertz.
So maybe a side thought on that, the last bullet here. There was a funny period in the Wi-Fi specifications when 2.4 was kind of starting to go away for a while, and then it came back with some later standards. So how do you see lots of like large deployments, etc. Do you see the role of 2.4 still being valid for this IoT? Maybe not so much for legacy, but for IoT type of use cases.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Because it comes down to that cost of the chipset description.
Right.
You've got to consider a lot of those devices, even customers using consumer or prosumer devices in the environment. A lot of the times they still only support 2.4 gigahertz. Sure. But you're right. I was actually very surprised when 802.11ax continues support for 2.4.
Yeah.
It almost felt like a step backwards, going from 5 gigahertz only AC.
Yeah.
And now we have 2.4 gigahertz supported on Wi-Fi 7. So that's the thing. 2.4 is not going away. It's just for our most important devices, the ones that we want to connect securely with the best performance and throughput and take advantage of 6 gigahertz. It's not likely going to be IoT devices. But I think a lot of IoT devices out there are still shipping with maybe 802.11n, 2.4 and 5. And the biggest question is whether they support WPA3 or not.
Yeah.
A lot of them don't, which is why we can talk a little bit about transition modes.
Yeah. All right.
So I think this next slide is sort of basically talking about that. We'll show this in the dashboard essentially. I'm sure many of you have played in the Mist dashboard, but we'll just go through some examples I think now of, let's start with the RF template, shall we?
Yeah.
Let's start with an RF template.
Before we go there, actually, I would like to go back 2 slides and address this one bullet here about WPA3. So obviously 6 gig and WPA3, they are tightly dependent, or let's say WPA3 is mandatory on 6 gig. But would you say it's a good practice to start sort of practicing with 4 6 gig by enabling WPA3 ahead of even considering moving to 6 gig?
Absolutely, yeah. That was sort of the point around the slides that I talked to with the adoption of this one customer from 2022. Right. The adoption rate with just enabling a WPA3 transition SSID, that was their soft approach, is just let's configure WPA3 transition and let's clients just naturally gravitate towards WPA3 as their default key management as they had firmware and operating system and software upgrades. That's the thing. It's that table, that particular slide that I had. It was the enterprise, the 802.1x, especially certificate-based authentication. WPA2 enterprise to WPA3 enterprise is the easiest one to do. You could probably almost do that with no testing. Obviously, it's still good to do testing, but a WPA2 enterprise one is where you should be able to easily move across. It's the pre-shared key simultaneous authentication of equals. That's the tricky one. Yeah, it needs a bit of assistance.
Okay. So what we have here now in the web browser, we have the Wi-Fi Fest 2024 organization that I created for this event. It's very plain. So basically, all we have here is the organization has been created with default settings. Nothing special has been done. I brought into inventory a couple of devices. So we have one AP, this AP45 here on the table. It's currently assigned to the Fest Kalastajatorppa site, where we have the Wi-Fi Fest. I have given it a name, and that's about it. And then we have one switch. It's a 4100F 12-port PoE switch sitting here happy doing nothing basically. So it's a default configuration, no VLANs, nothing, basic stuff. And then we have the Cradlepoint 4G, 5G gateway acting as a NAT device, handing out IP addresses via DHCP. So that's a very, very basic setup. So the idea here is, like Steven said, maybe we'll start from the basics going up, possibly starting with RF template. So surprise, surprise, we have nothing here. So let's go ahead. What should we pay attention on here?
Yeah, as I mentioned, it obviously depends on what you're doing with 2.4 gigahertz today. Generally, the first starting point, people are sort of structuring their templates depending on the use case for the sites or a group of sites, where we use site groups as a label. Some customers also do country-based RF templates, which you don't necessarily need to do.
Right.
So a lot of people, the first thing you see there is you've got name and then you've got country. But MIS will actually use the country location of the site. So when you create the sites, either manually or by cloning or by bulk through scripting, we will use the country code based on the site configuration. So you could actually use a single template if it meets all of your RF requirements for all of your sites, if you're talking about an international deployment. So that's one thing people don't realize. So sometimes they go a bit overkill with RF templates. Typically, you would see a standard density in terms of like an office deployment, maybe a high density if you have an office where you're going, okay, we know that we're going to be running pretty much 5 gigahertz only clients with maybe some 6 gigahertz. We know 2.4 is not going to be there. There's a higher chance that we might be using automatic dual 5 gigahertz. Maybe you have a high density template and you've got a higher density of APs. And then you might have a low density, or you might have a warehouse deployment where you want to do some overrides for external antennas and things like that. So
this seems to be quite confusing for some people about this country setting, because like you said, you don't have to specify the country, because we will know the country based on the site settings. So you can do either way. You can do any, or you can do country based, but you do not have to do country specific RF templates. That's the key message, I guess.
And I think until you need to change something as an exception to the rule or the standard that you're defining, you shouldn't need to create another RF template. And most commonly, I'll see that's either due to channel support. Maybe there's a particular country or a site where you want to exclude DFS channels, for example, or there's a specific reason you need to do different minimum and maximum transmit powers, then maybe you would have a different RF template for that.
Okay, so then there is a situations when many ask, okay, this is like a big brush that I'm using to paint my RF kind of limits or borders, boundaries. What kind of tools are there to then deviate from this big brush thing if you need to have some group of APs acting differently from our respective or different models of APs acting differently? Can you mention some of those?
My rule of thumb, and I see Rob's creep to the front because he might chime in. My rule of thumb is like I said, unless there's an exception case, I wouldn't do another template. And when I'm talking about another template, because we apply the RF templates at a site level, I would be treating that whole site the same with this new template. If you're talking about specific APs, maybe there's a particular room, or there's some perimeter APs in a building and you want to tune down their transmit power or override the channels they're using, that's what we use device profiles for. So maybe we'll get into some device profiles in a little bit. But again, if I was making a decision to do another RF template, I'd want to make sure it's justified for that entire site.
Okay, so anything special to mention about 2.4? Is there anything we should, by default, like best practice, change here?
The first thing I would be doing is powering down the minimum transmit power. We generally want at least 6 dBs of separation between the maximum of what 2.4 is and what the minimum of 5 gigahertz is. That's probably better demonstrated in Harmona, if you haven't played with that, to at least see what the difference in transmit power is on an AP between 2.4 and 5, and also 6. because we want to try and encourage our devices from an RF perspective to associate to 5 gigahertz before 2.4.
Okay.
So unless there's a specific need for higher 2.4, I would do that.
And for channels on 2.4, we don't need to do anything if we are
shouldn't
going
need
by
to
the
set
book.
that unless you're operating somewhere, which is very rare these days. I think even Japan is phasing this out, where they used to support channel 14. They still support it, but lower transmit power, so it's not really useful. Most of the time, you'd be using channels 1, 6, and 11, which is what we set automatic on 2.4 anyway.
Yeah, that's the default. So if you don't, if you leave it like this, it's 1, 6, 11.
And we intentionally don't allow you to change channel width on 2.4 because that's silly. So.
How about 5?
5 gigahertz. We default to 40 megahertz wide because it's quite safe these days. And then safe is a how long is your piece of string sort of question, because it really depends on the environment you're deploying into. If you're deploying into a multi-floor office building, you might have neighbors that are using 80 megahertz wide channels on full transmit power, or you might be deploying into a multi-dwelling apartment building, same thing again, lots of home or ISP provided routers, they default to usually 80 megahertz wide and 5 gigahertz. So it depends. It's a safe starting point, but if you know that you're already doing a high density deployment and you're not going to have a lot of reuse across your channel plan, depending on what you've done with Harmona, if you've done some channel planning in there as well, you might see that there's already, just from a deployment of a baseline of a network, you might have too much co-channel interference using 40 megahertz. So you would probably drop to 20 in that case.
Sure.
So you could do that, especially if you're ever manually or having missed radio resource management automatically do dual 5 gigahertz, always use 20 megahertz, because otherwise you'll quickly run out of channels if you're doing dual 5 gigahertz as well. Even if we don't convert all of the APs to dual 5 gigahertz, it's usually not good to run 40s in that instance. So,
how about channels on 5?
Yeah, so that comes back to the use case by exception. I've seen a lot of instances where not enough information gathering is done before transitioning a deployment over to Juniper Mist, and this is not a vendor-specific thing anyway. It could happen with any vendor going from vendor X to vendor Y. If you don't do your homework and check your configuration that's currently running, you could run into all sorts of problems. And where I've seen this especially is warehouses and distribution centers with voice over Wi-Fi handsets and scanners. Maybe they're just configured for Uni 1 channels and that's it. But you go and deploy Mist on using all 5 gigahertz channels, RRM will do a fantastic job of a channel plan across the entire warehouse, but from the clients that are only configured for Uni 1, they might only see a channel on every sort of 5th or 6th AP, and it'll look terrible. So until you dig behind the scenes and go, well, we can only see that the client's associating on Uni 1 channels, maybe they're only configured for Uni 1. So yeah, you definitely have to make sure that you're doing your homework in terms of information gathering for what your clients are configured for and what the previous network was configured for. We will show you, and we can give an example of this probably from live demo a bit later, of DFS being impacted, and you might then see enough events in the Mist event logs as to where you want to exclude a channel from this list due to too many DFS hits. And this is where I've seen customers will create a separate RF template, and they'll, prepend it with non-DFS RF template or whatever, or excluding channel, XYZ.
So I guess one might think that, one approach for 5 gig channels would be to leave everything on by, start with that and then monitor the RF events if there are DFS events, radar events, stuff like that happening, and then go and exclude those channels that are getting most hit by DFS. And then, like you said, the client base is key. So there are a couple of these higher band channels which are questionable if you don't know your client base and stuff like that.
Yep.
So that's important to understand that these, like the four highest channels, these are a question mark in some environments where you don't know your client base.
Yep.
Some clients might not support these channels. So this is something to pay attention to.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
So before you continue down there, I just wanted to highlight another point at the top of that 5 gigahertz section. If you go, or even 2.4, to be honest, to the default settings. So another misconception is that if you're using different AP models, maybe you've got AP43s or AP45s indoors and you're deploying AP63s or AP64s outdoors, some people think you need a different RF template for that because maybe your previous vendor did things that way, or you need to do device profiles to override different AP models. You don't have to, because you can do those by exception as an override within the RF template. So you could come in here and set specific settings for outdoor APs if you wanted to, different minimum, maximum transmit powers, or you could disable a band. We also allow you to do the settings for external antennas. So again, you might have a warehouse, which is a mix of omnidirectional internal AP45s, for example, but also using in-aisle coverage with AP45Es. You can use the same RF template from the transmit power and channel perspective, but we need to go in there and set the antenna gain for those external antennas, and we can do that. If you scroll up to the highlight there, and we could go to an AP45E, for example, and we can come down and say the antenna gain for that particular antenna that's being used is, say, 8 dBi. And it's only applicable to AP45Es using that RF template. We don't need to do a whole other template for those or treat them as a separate site or do a device profile for those. We can handle that within the template.
Cool tip.
So the last big thing on here is these the auto settings for 2.4 and dual band radio settings. Again, that's depends where you're coming from, depends on client support and what you're doing. We'll show you the wireless LAN configuration in the templates, which you're probably familiar with. You can specify whether the individual wireless LANs or SSIDs are 2.4 or 5 or 6 or any combination of those. But you may also want to control it from the RF template level. If you know that all of your SSIDs are only going to be 5 and 6, for example, you could come in here and disable 2.4. But you could also just leave 2.4 disabled on your SSIDs and you'll have the same net outcome. So there's a couple of ways of achieving that. The biggest consideration is whether you want MIST's AI-driven RRM, radio resource management, to make the decisions on which 2.4 gigahertz radios to disable, which we can do across any of our access points models to sort of reduce the interference from having too many 2.4 gigahertz radios enabled. And then the other option, in a similar fashion, is using radio resource management to automatically determine which access point dual band radios, which can do either 2.4 and 5 gigahertz, should be operating in dual band mode, so 2.4 and 5, or dual 5, so 5 and 5. And so you can see there, it's only on specific access point models. The AP47 will come in there soon. So you can hard set. If you need to support 2.4 and you need to support 2.4 everywhere, you could put hard set here as 2.4 gigahertz on that dual band radio setting, and then you've got lots of coverage everywhere in 2.4. But my recommendation, I think, is if you don't need 2.4, disable it in the RF template, leave the dual band radio settings to auto, and as Tommy mentioned, deploy it, and we can monitor it in MIST and say, are we getting interference from our own APs? We can see that in the MIST dashboard. Do we change down to 20 megahertz wide channels, or do we disable dual 5 gigahertz? You know, every environment's going to depend, but it's usually a safe starting point.
All right. So how about 6? You mentioned about channel width, that in Europe we don't have too much luxury with bandwidth at 6. So it would be probably either 80 or 40. 80 is the default. Yeah,
80 is the default. Yes, we're a US-based company, so they're considering their whole 1.2 gigahertz of extra spectrum. I would say 40 megahertz wide is a safe default for 6 gigahertz for Europe. And again, just keep that in mind with your client support. Clients are going to look at an SSID across one radio on an access point, and they're going to say, well, is my signal strength from 5 gigahertz stronger, or is my signal strength from 6 gigahertz stronger? And then they're going to say, well, is the channel bandwidth wider on the on the 5 gigahertz or the 6 gigahertz? They will look at a number of different other elements, such as number of associated stations or channel occupancy or anything else. But they definitely use channel bandwidth as a consideration as roaming. So that influences both interband roaming on a single AP, as well as intraband and interband roaming from AP to AP as well in those decisions. So you wouldn't want to have, for example, 40 megahertz wide on 5 gigahertz and 20 megahertz wide on 6, your clients will almost never choose 6 gigahertz just because of the channel width.
All right, let's leave it at 80 now so that we get nicer data rates.
Yeah.
So let's create
Do a nice
this
speed
guy.
test on them.
Yeah. Create this, and then one important thing is to actually remember to enable this RF template under the site settings. So we need to go under our Kalastajatorppa site, and on the RF template list, we check Fest RF template that we just created. And you guys could see the orange text here, so this is one thing to remember. If you are coming from a controller-based Wi-Fi network where things that you make on RF changes, they are being deployed immediately, that does not happen with the cloud-based architecture. So if you want those changes to be deployed immediately, you need to go here and then say that, okay, update now. But typically, it's enough to have the changes becoming effective night after I make the change. Or what do you think?
Sounds good.
Yeah. All right. Then what?
Next, we need to create some SSIDs, don't we?
That's
Or at least one
scary
SSID.
part. Yeah.
So wireless LAN templates are sort of handled in a similar way. Unless you need to do something by exception, you probably don't need to create multiple templates. However, we've learnt from experience with working with lots of customers and partners over the years that it's actually a good idea to split out your SSIDs into their own individual template. It just makes it easier for any moves, adds, or changes to those SSIDs, and it makes it easier to assign SSIDs and wireless LANs to different sites or site groups, and add exceptions when you actually do it per template. So there's not a wrong or right way to do it. It's just our recommendation on what we've seen in the wild. As it's usually easier to do a different template for each SSID. You can enable them, disable them, move them around, change them, and apply them to different sites and site groups. And
that's a good point, because usually when we are doing those POCs that Ilpo mentioned, we love to do POCs. And when customers configure this by themselves, if that happens, they usually make multiple SSIDs on the same template. And I always try to say that, okay, that's fine, it works, no worries, but you will maintain maximum flexibility if you have only one SSID per template.
That is a really good point, because we almost make it too easy from a proof of concept and labbing perspective, because most people do start out at the site level, creating a WLAN, which is fine, but that's only going to work at that particular site. And yes, you can select a single WLAN or multiple WLANs at a site and go create template. So if you had 3 SSIDs under the site level and go create template, it will bring them all into an individual template. So it's not hard to change it after the fact. It's just if you're starting from scratch and want to get it in the best way possible, this is our recommendation.
All right. So let's create the SSID there.
Do we want to do a WPA3 and an OWE, or just WPA3? I think let's start with OWE. I think, because at least what you'll see here is you'll see the tooltips that, for 6 gigahertz you need WPA3 and or OWE. You need at least one of those improved security methods, and it also gives you a note that there's a firmware requirement, which most people should be running newer than that firmware these days anyway. The biggest question for OWE is whether or not to enable OWE transition. It's a safe way to move and test OWE. You can use the visibility and mist to check at each site how many clients are just natively connecting with OWE without any manual intervention versus those that are still connecting on the old unencrypted open authentication. Another big consideration, especially if you're still using 2.4 gigahertz widely, is if you already have a lot of SSIDs, ideally you wouldn't have too many SSIDs, one for 802.1x or enterprise, one for maybe pre-shared key or multi-pre-shared key, maybe one for guest, maybe one for IoT, but you could argue whether you need that. If you're already using 2.4 today, you might already be creating some of your own code channel interference on the network. Enabling OWE transition with 2.4 gigahertz enables actually creates a second hidden SSID to steer those clients to OWE from an open network. So you're essentially, again, adding another SSID when you enable OWE transition. So it could introduce some additional overhead on 2.4. And likely, if you're doing the same in 5 gigahertz and you've got high density and you're already having high channel utilization or capacity issues or Wi-Fi interference issues in 5 gigahertz, this will not help things by enabling OWE transitions. So
should we be progressive and leave it disabled then? Try to go with
we'll leave it disabled. Let's see how many natively attach themselves to that.
Okay. So anything else worth mentioning? Data rates maybe?
Yeah, I mean, this is obviously, if we're talking about 2.4 and IoT and legacy devices, that's going to influence what this SSID is for and what data rates you might need to enable. My recommendation, at least from a proof of concept or a labbing perspective to test this out, is starting with a safe middle ground of configuring 12 megabits per second as your basic mandatory rate and everything above as supported. So you're basically killing off support for the legacy protocols like BNG.
So would you go with this kind of setting, or would you go custom?
I usually go custom with 12 megabits per second as mandatory. Because again, there can be some funny client issues with the high density rates, which is having 24 megabits per second as mandatory. So if you're already using 24 megabits per second as a mandatory rate in your environment today, you probably could go and safely enable high density rates if you're already doing a high density deployment.
So you would go like this.
Thoughts, Rob?
Oops.
You've got your chance to come back and undo it all later. Anyway, that's what I found is a good, safe middle ground. If someone's looking for a recommendation for a proof of concept or a new deployment, this will be where I start. And then if I know that the deployment is going to be high density, once it's been running for a while, we know that radio resource management has tuned the transmit power levels, and we have a look at capacity or just anything else, we could say, you know what, let's test going to the high density rates and just remove further overhead on the air from that.
All right.
And another best practice is the filtering. This makes a big difference, especially in high density networks, especially universities and offices when you have a lot of traffic on the wire. Enabling the ARP filtering cuts down on those requests coming from the wire to the wireless interface, and same does the broadcast multicast filtering. So that's OWE. It's applied to the entire org. There was an option there where you can apply it to sites or site groups, but Tomi's just put it to the entire org, which means that should be applied to the test access point now. We can, give it a couple of minutes to sync the configuration, it'll show under there as the WLANs. But you should actually see that Fest. What did you call it? Fest OWE?
Fest something, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, let's do the other one while it gets ready. Let's go back to organization. So what do you feel about site templates? That's site SSIDs. That's another common thing from POCs by customers.
Sorry, I missed that. Say it again.
Because, like you said, it's too easy
to
go. I create the WLAN on the site level.
You can show. Let's show it. Let's create the next WLAN from the site level.
Yes.
So we've already brought down the template level WLAN at the site, but we want to create one, and this is going to be mistakenly done at the site level, but we'll then bring it into a template. So we're going to make this WPA3 personal SAE, and then likewise. With OWE, you had a transition. Now we have a enable WPA3, WPA2 transition, which is that slide that I showed you with the adoption numbers from 2022 to 2023. That's what most people are doing with pre-shared key, is enabling transition to just monitor how many devices are natively connecting out of the box as they are without any manual intervention, and then just getting to a point in time where they say, okay, we know that all of our managed devices, or at least BYD devices, support WPA3. Let's just shut off WPA2.
Okay. So and we'll go with no legacy in this case. It's easy to configure. And filtering. And that's it.
Yeah. So there's obviously different options under here, depending on whether you're centralizing your data plane. You might have a missed edge. There'll be different configuration options. If you're doing Bonjour Gateway, there'll be different options under there. But we're just sort of taking the general recommendations. So we see there's already a couple of clients connected to that, I think. Nice. One actually good recommendation is a lot of people don't realize this, especially when they're new to Mist and they come into the dashboard, is they don't realize that on the Wi-Fi clients, wired clients, APs, switches page, you can actually customize the columns and the details you can see in here. There's a lot of information that a lot of people don't realize is there. It's just hidden by default. So highly recommend having a look through some of these. You don't need to enable all of them, but definitely some useful things around security, the protocol, the band, the channel, RSSI, SNR, those sorts of things. You can drag the order around, and that's only for your browser session. If you clear your browser cache or if you use it in a different browser, it'll change and it won't be relevant to anyone else's login. But it is handy to have those extra details there. I like to see, on the access points page what the 5 gigahertz and 6 gigahertz transmit power is, all those sorts of things. So that's another recommendation.
Okay, it seems that we have users on both SSIDs. Nice.
Oh, someone picked up on the passphrase you configured. That was quickly. So how would we move that site level template, site level WLAN to a template?
Right, so this might have been a mistake or not. So site level SSIDs are actually quite useful when you have site level admins. I guess that's the kind of the mostly used use cases, that you have some guy on site XYZ and he's capable enough to manage some stuff regarding Wi-Fi on that site. So you could give that guy site admin level rights, and then he could create and edit and delete his own SSIDs on that site. And then some other SSIDs might be coming from the top down from organization level. Those are the ones that he cannot edit or delete even by accident. So that's probably the most seen use case for site level SSIDs.
Yeah.
But typically in a true life organization, there is not much, at least I haven't seen too much use for that site level SSID configuration. So in this case, let's say this was a mistake. I wanted to do this on the organization level, then I can just make it a template from here. So click, and then I could give it a name, Fest another template. This is so creative. Template. Like so. And now we suddenly have 2 templates on the organization level. Right, and what happens now is that we still have the original. No, we don't.
Yeah, we do, because you didn't specify the sites or site groups.
Yeah. So then we have this guy here, and now what happens is that we will have 3 SSIDs if we leave both the site level and the organization level alive. That's bad. So let's get rid of this. How many? Sorry, how many? Well, of course, you want to have the maximum. That's 16. Just kidding. No, I mean.
So I briefly mentioned it before, right? Generally, you want to try and limit the use cases, and even today, we're still seeing an SSID per use case in terms of segmentation or VLANs or anything like that. So these days, there shouldn't be many reasons why people would need a separate 802.1x enabled SSID. You can usually handle multiple use cases, whether that's certificate-based authentication or username and password authentication. Obviously, with cloud-based radius, most use cases are moving towards certificate-based authentication. Pre-shared key, maybe in the past you've had different pre-shared keys and different VLANs and multiple SSIDs. We can solve that with multiple pre-shared key now. And typically you would have 1 guest SSID. So ideally that would be 3. Maybe you would have a separate IoT or something else that's by exception. But usually when I see multiple SSIDs out there, it's just either people haven't had the opportunity to or the knowledge to consolidate those use cases into a single SSID. And they don't necessarily realize the impact of the overhead on the airtime and the channel utilization from having multiple SSIDs broadcast over the air.
I think my personal view has always been that if you have like half a dozen, then you are doing something wrong. That's for sure.
Yeah. Any more than 4, I'd be concerned. Yeah. Another question?
Yeah, it can be. I mean, it can be really bad if you have lots of SSIDs just to have them there. That's going to eat your airtime. So not a good idea.
I think Harmony can do a good job of visualizing that, right?
Yeah. All right. So now we have, like we should have, we have 2 different templates, one for each SSID. Where was I here? We have 2 different templates. I deleted the one that was on the site level, and on the AP level, we now have 2 SSIDs alive. We should have at least, and they are coming both from the organization level template, like we can see here. All righty.
We've got 14 people connected. Lots of speed tests being run.
Anybody running speed test?
We've got 9 people connected on 6 gigahertz. That's pretty good.
But yeah, but like I said, it's what kind of data rates are you seeing? Anyone who is connected, can you see your data rates? That's more interesting than the throughput, because the 4G is, 5G is limiting here.
Let me connect. What was the passphrase?
Kalastajatorppa. It's very, very simple. Here you go. Sorry about that. Day rate.
Did I get it right? I didn't get it right.
Anything else we should cover before we leave? Let the stage.
I think the good thing is, because we've only configured a 5 gigahertz and 6 gigahertz SSID on the AP45, we haven't required anything higher in terms of power from that switch. Do you want to configure 2.4 and show people what the dashboard will do with not enough power? So obviously, I mentioned earlier, going into Wi-Fi 7, it'll be different rules again, because more radios, more capabilities, more things in the access point will require more PoE, but little things just around even the PoE usage on an access point, and how we show it in the MIST dashboard when an access point is running in a less than maximum power mode, and then we actually show it in the dashboard as to how many spatial streams then enabled on that particular access point as well, which is handy visibility that I've not seen that in other vendors. Is it enabled yet? Did you disable it in the RF template?
I don't think so. I don't think I did on that level. It was just on the SSID level. Yeah.
We've got 2.4, 2.4. There we go. Yeah. One AP has reduced functionality.
Yeah.
So if we go into that AP, I think we're absolutely killing the speed test, by the way. I can't connect.
Yeah, I guess most of you who have been dealing with MIST dashboard and had newer APs onboarded, you have seen this orange warning sign. It's not the end of the world. The AP will go down a bit on the turbo pressures, but it's not nice to look at. So that's why you need to have more modern switches with PoE, more PoE budget and more powerful PoE ports. Alrighty. So
any questions before we wrap this up and hand it over to the Harmony team about 6 gigahertz or WPA3 or?
Kyllä. Eli kysymys oli, että nyt tässä konfiguraatiossa meillä oli se SSID alla, niin pistettiin sellaisena ilman täkkäystä sinne lankaverkkoon. Ja sitten jos on useampi SSID, niin silloinhan, nythän me laittaa ne molemmat samaan, mutta tässä testitilanteessa. Mutta sitten siellä tosielämässä tietenkin pistää eri VLANeihin, ja siihen on sitten erilaisia tapoja, joita me tuetaan. Et sä voit staattisesti pistää sen tiettyyn VLAN, niin sä voit pistää sen VLAN pooliin, jolloin siellä on sitten useampi VLAN siellä lankaverkon puolella, ja me jaetaan niihin sitten hässäyksen perusteella niitä klientteja, tai sitten, mikä on aika yleistä, niin dynaamisesti radius-attribuuttien perusteella, mitä palautuu esimerkiksi ryhmäjäsenyksien perusteella sitten vaikka Azure AD:sta tai mistä tahansa että se on ihan kyllä peruskauraa sitten. Siinä me ymmärretään siis, niin kun, nythän meillä tämä aksesaalisuoraise, mistä oli aikaisemmin puhetta, niin se ei ollut kovin pitkään vielä, mikä tarkoittaa sitä, että valtaosa meidän toteutuksista, niin me pelataan sitten yhteen joko vaikka ISEN tai ClearPassin tai jonkun muun kanssa, ja tarkoittaa sitä, että me tuetaan tosi laajasti niitä attribuutteja, mitä sieltä tulee, niin kuin tavallaan niitä murteita radiuksesta. Et se on ihan niin kuin business as usual niin sanotusti. Selvä. Okay, so let's swap. Who is going to be next on the stage?
Thank you, everyone. Great. Hope that was useful.
Thank you, guys.
And,
thank you.
Feel free to reach out with any other questions in the next break.
Absolutely.